Hello. I might just kind of wait a couple minutes, not a couple minutes, a few moments to see if people are going to jump on the live. I only have a short amount of time to talk about what I came to talk about today. So I'm not going to wait too long. Luckily, this will be available on the replay across all my platforms for anyone who needs this information who's not available to jump on live. So with that being said, I guess I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and get started here. So I have some notes down here if you guys see me looking, because as I mentioned, I only have a short amount of time. I'm actually interviewing a guest for my podcast show, which I'm really excited about. We're going to be talking about gut health and how trauma affects the gut. So my time is limited because I am doing that interview here in about 30 minutes or so. So I did keep some notes because that's going to help keep me on track, because if not, this short 10-minute live could easily turn into who knows how long if left to my own devices. So one thing that I notice is that we constantly hear, and I post stuff like this too, so there's no judgment in this statement by any means, because this is a big part of the content that I also post. But one thing we often hear about is this idea that triggers are leading us to deeper healing, that our triggers are always about us and never about the other person or situation or experience that we're having. And that's all fine and dandy, and that is 100% true. Sorry, my pups, of course, are going to follow me in here and walk around and click their toenails. Nala, can you lay down? Can you lay down? Which is going to be really distracting for me and likely for anyone watching this. Anyways, so jumping back into what I was saying, all of that is true. Our triggers are 100% meant for us, and they are an invitation and an opportunity for deeper healing. But what I find is that so often we just have these really broad statements like, your triggers are your problem, your triggers are your responsibility, your triggers are a doorway to deeper healing. Great, but how, right? I feel like the how of that, Nala, stop. I feel like the how of that is not very often expressed, right? So that statement's true, but I feel like it leaves so many people with the big question mark of like, great, like, how do I do that? How do I manage to process all of this and allow it to lead me to this healing that I'm constantly hearing about? So today I kind of wanted to share with you an experience that I had in my own personal life, which kind of inspired me to make this live, because I really witnessed myself and how I dealt with the trigger and how I processed it and the end result. And it's just a process that I believe can really help everyone, a tool that anyone can use who's dealing with triggering. And it is a tool to help us heal and release the trigger and identify, right? Where does this trigger originate from? So a little bit about triggering before I kind of share my story is that when we are triggered, what happens, especially if it's valid, and I think this is why it's so difficult for people to hear this message of like, your triggers, your problem, your triggers, your work, because it doesn't always make sense if we are sitting there thinking, okay, like, wait a minute, like the thing I'm triggered about is actually valid. Like, somebody did something that absolutely wasn't right. And maybe that's a sign from our boundaries, right? The invitation to create healthier boundaries, or the indication that we don't have strong enough boundaries. But whatever the reason is, often we feel very justified and validated in what is triggering us. And it's not to say that those things aren't valid, but what happens in this triggering state is that the ego becomes activated, okay? Because that's what the ego's job is to keep us safe. The ego is very defensive of you. And anytime you feel triggered, we almost always have ego activation. And it's in that space that we often find that we are identified with the ego. So what does that sound like if we're triggered and we're identified with the ego? The justification, the outward projection onto other people, like this idea that somebody made me feel a certain way. And I have really difficult news to share with some of you, but nobody makes you feel anyway. People behave the way they behave. And the harsh truth of this experience that we're in is that we will never be able to control the behavior of others. It doesn't matter. It's impossible. It's never going to happen. So when we are trying to control the behavior of others and become triggered when we can't, that's when we experience a lot of those heavy emotions that we have. And the truth is, as long as we are holding on to this idea that people make us feel a certain way through their behavior, we're always coming from a disempowered space in that thinking. The empowerment piece really comes in when you realize that you have a choice in how you're going to move forward, how you're going to process the experience. And it moves you from being reactive to responsive. And in responsiveness, that empowerment piece really comes in, because then you can decide, what do I need to shift? What do I need to heal? What boundaries do I need to become stronger on? So these are all ways that works with the triggering. But when we are really identified with the ego in the moment, it becomes very difficult to examine the trigger. Okay. So, and I'll talk more about this in the process, but it's really important that as we're doing the inner work, that we aren't trying to address the trigger in the triggering moment, because it's almost impossible to have clear thinking in that state. Okay, so we really can't benefit from examining our trigger. And more than likely what's going to happen if we try to visit that trigger in the triggering moment is that we're going to start ruminating on it, like the ego likes to do. So the ego likes to hold on, the ego likes to be defensive, the ego likes to ruminate on how badly you were wronged, or how wrong the situation is, or how unfair the situation is. That's all ego narrative, and there's nothing wrong with being identified with that voice for a little while. We have an ego for a reason. So this is definitely not about demonizing the ego. I don't believe in doing that. I believe in loving the ego, nurturing the ego, and giving the ego compassion and love. So it's really difficult, as I said, to visit the trigger and gain any benefit from it. So I'm going to share a little bit with you very quickly about an experience that I recently had and how I worked through it. And the same way that I worked through it in these processes and these steps, I guess I should say, in this process, is the same way that you can work through triggers as well. So as some of you might know, I do have a side gig. I work only 2 nights a week at a little really adorable restaurant that I love right up the street for me. But there's a lot of personalities in there, not just in like the customers that I deal with, but also in the employees that I work with. And so anytime we're dealing with a lot of different personalities, I think there's always that risk of like, some people aren't going to maybe be a vibrational match for each other. Some people aren't going to necessarily view things the same way as we do. And it really kind of sets the scene, I guess you could say, for being triggered. And I'm no exception of this, because after all, we're all human. And I think that's the thing. It's not about not being triggered, and we don't ever get to a place in our healing where we're not triggered. Where we get to in our healing is that when we are triggered, we are able to take a step back and handle it in a healthy way, which prevents us from acting outside of our integral belief system and doing or saying things that we will later regret or feel ashamed of or guilty about. And then we have a whole other situation to be dealt with in that scenario. So this process really helps us avoid acting outside of our integral belief system in that moment when we are really identified with the voice of our ego. So long story short, I was at work and some things unfolded, and the details of these things are not important on any level. It does not matter. All that matters is that I felt extremely pissed. frustrated and pissed off. Like I was just angry. What was, I could understand clearly that the situation that was unfolding was ridiculous, not well thought out, and not really honoring or fair to me. And I still stand by that. Okay. However, in saying that now, there's no anger attached to it. I can just view the situation for what it was from a neutral viewpoint. Okay. So anyways, in the moment, however, I was very pissed. I mean, and I really had to check myself. And I had to, sorry, my daughter just texted me and it distracted me because her poor puppy just tested positive for parvo. So anyways, let me get my train of thought again. But anyways, in that moment, I really had to check myself. Okay, so the first step was nervous system self-regulation, things that alerted me that I was becoming dysregulated, racing heartbeat, racing thoughts, shaking hands, this deep desire to make my case heard, to prove my point, to point out how wrong everyone else in this situation is, to throw fits. These are all common things of the ego as well. Okay, so those were my first reaction. Those are the things that I wanted to do. But because I was observing this from the most neutral standpoint that I could in the moment, I realized step one, nervous system regulation. Okay, so deep breathing, relaxing the muscles of the body. And the reason why this is so beneficial is because when we are triggered and dysregulation of the nervous system is activated, what happens is we really minimize the function of these frontal lobes in the brain. And these frontal lobes are what are in control of decision making and planning and logic and all these really important functions when we're moving through life and dealing with other people, right? And what does become activated is this more primitive and primal part of the brain. That's the fight, flight, freeze. We're all pretty familiar with that. I'm definitely a fighter. Okay. So when I get really triggered and I'm triggered in that primal part, I'm like, let's go. I'm about to make a scene. I'm about to, raise my voice. I'm about to let everybody know what's up. Okay. That doesn't help me, and it's definitely not serving for anyone else. So step one is getting that frontal part of the brain activated through nervous system regulation. Stepping away from the situation, again, as I said, taking some deep breaths, releasing where we begin to hold in the body, because when we are activated in that primal part, all the muscles tense up. This is in preparation for, are we going to fight or are we going to flee? And it's kind of just hardwired. So we aren't conscious of it, okay? But that's how the body's responding to triggering. So when we are able to soothe that part of the brain, calm that part of the brain down, deactivate it through literally just focusing on the body. Deep breaths in, deep breaths out, deep breaths in, deep breaths out, relaxing the muscles of the body on those exhalations. And of course, in this moment, I also did send my partner and girlfriend a very lengthy, about 3-paragraph message about how pissed I was. So that was just a little release. And sometimes that release is great because it kind of gets out that initial frustration, and it's a release in a safe place. So if you have a safe space, a quick verbal processing to kind of just like get all of it out can be really beneficial. And my partner is amazing, and knowing me as well as she does, she really didn't come in and interject anything other than, this is shitty, I'm sorry, you're right. And that was perfect, because that's kind of what I needed, or what my ego needed at that moment, I should say, is to be validated. Okay. So that was perfect for her. She wasn't trying to, have me look at things differently, because in that moment, I was not really open for that kind of feedback. I really just needed space held for me why I vented about it. So I resolved in that moment, obviously, to work through the nervous system regulation and just to sit with it, okay? Meaning, I'm not going to take any actionable step tonight. I'm not going to say anything to anyone in this state of mind. I'm not going to speak to, higher up management at this point, because I recognize this is not the state of mind that I need to be expressing anything in. I need to get my wits about me. I need to figure out what I really feel about all this, and then come from an aligned space, a regulated space, and deal with it at that point. So I left work and I resolved to not allowing myself to ruminate on it, meaning I'm not going to continue to get worked up about it. I'm not going to continue to give this trigger energy. What I'm going to do is kind of put it on the back burner. I'm going to stay present in the moment, put it on the back burner, and get a good night's rest. Okay, so that's step 2, is putting some space between you and the triggering situation. That is how we become responsive instead of reactive. So putting that space, it's going to be there. The situation will still be available for you to deal with at a different time, but putting a little space. And, it's perfect that this happened at night because sleep is the ultimate reset. It really gives the brain and the energetic body that reset to start fresh the next day and in a more grounded, aligned space. And so step 2 is give the trigger some space. Wait until you're completely regulated. Wait until the ego has become deactivated. That's really going to help you to look at what's happening from the most neutral viewpoint. So I went home, I resolved, I'm back, I'm putting a pen in this. I'm not going to sit here and continue to verbally spew about it with my partner. I'm not going to allow my mind to continue to think about how messed up everything was this night, etc. I'm just going to give it a break and let it rest. Okay, so that's step 2. Step 3, which is what I did the next morning. After I had given this trigger some space, I was in a really juicy, yummy state of mind. My nervous system was regulated. Now it's time to visit the trigger. Now it's time to look at the situation, because you can do so without all the attached anger, frustration, sadness, whatever that specific triggering emotion is for you. When you revisit it after giving it some space, you're able to deactivate that heavy emotion and just look at that from a really broad perspective, is I guess what you would say. And when I was able to do that, and this is how, and I want to point out, we heal our triggers, and this is how these things always have to do with us and never the other person. So while the situation that had unfolded, I was completely valid in feeling how I felt and having that moment of anger and frustration, because it was definitely warranted. Like, the things that were happening were BS. It wasn't okay. It wasn't right. It wasn't well thought out. And it definitely wasn't considerate of my time in any way, shape, or form. So those things all held true. But the question is, why did it make me get so angry? So that's really where you have to focus. Not on I was right and they were wrong. That is ego thinking, okay? The focus has to then be like, okay, now I need to start asking, why did this affect me in such a strong way as it did? And when I was able to look at that from that neutral perspective, what I realized is, of course, this is triggering past wounds that I have about not feeling like I'm being considered. I have really big issues around feeling like I'm being respected, like my time is being honored, like people are valuing what I'm bringing to the table in each given situation. Because there is a lot in the past, and for some of you who don't know this part of my story, I've been in a lot of abusive relationships before I did my healing work. Those are the types of partners that I attracted. And when I say abusive, I mean severe abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse for a very, very long time. And in those abusive situations, I was often not respected. I was often not heard. I was often not being honored. And it all manifested eventually into a whole lot of anger before I started healing it all, to the point that, well, never mind. Actually, we're not going to go there right now. I'm running on time, and I can't go down that rabbit hole, but to the point that it was like affecting my life in other ways. And so when I was able to compare these situations, it was very clear to me, okay, so let's talk about how I felt. I felt like I wasn't being respected. I felt like I wasn't being considered. I felt like my time wasn't being honored. And that felt bad because it reminded me in some ways of other times in life. Of course, those situations were much more severe. I wasn't in an abusive situation while I was experiencing this at my job. But that's how triggering works, and it's not always logical. And because I experienced some of these same feelings and thoughts that I had experienced in these abusive situations in my past, I was able to recognize, oh, this is why this was so freaking upsetting for me. And there's something magical that happens in that moment when you really can connect the dots and you can understand what is the root cause wounding aspect that's creating this trigger. Is that the situation that happened the night before all of a sudden didn't have any power over me. My anger had lifted, my frustration was lifted. I all of a sudden was like, oh, well, it's not that big of a deal. I can actually let this go. I don't need to hold grudges. I don't need to be angry. I don't need to continue to think about how this situation was unfair to me because I understand it. And it wasn't something I had to consciously, okay, I'm letting this go. No. In following these steps in this process, that trigger was naturally healed because I was like, what I really need to be focusing on is this understanding of why these situations trigger me. And then with that understanding, next time something like this happens, I can look and say, okay, you already know why this is triggering you, but let's remember, Kelly, these two situations aren't comparable, okay? So you're not in an abusive situation. You don't need your ego to rear up like this in this situation. It's okay just to let this go. It's okay to have some perspective and realize this actually isn't such a big deal. And those triggers are naturally healed in that way. So that's kind of the long and short of it right there. Be sure if you jumped onto this midway, start from the beginning. There's lots of valuable information. It's a 3 or 4 step process that I've just walked over with everyone using a situation from my own life as an example. And before my alarm goes off to let me know it's time for me to get ready for my podcast interview, which is going to happen in like 2 minutes and interrupt this live, I just want to extend the invitation for anybody out there who feels like they would like some more one-on-one help, some accountability, some really unique and specific processes and tools to help you through your triggering and shadow work. I have an open availability right now in my coaching calendar. And in addition to that, these are long-term commitments. But in addition to that, I've also just launched a short-term one-on-one, one-off session. So this is a one-time session. These are end-of-year clarity sessions that I do every single year. So if you want to learn more about the clarity session I'm offering these at such a discounted price, $88, under $100, because after all, it's the holidays at the end of the year. We're all budgeting. Money can be tight. And I don't want anyone to miss out on this opportunity because of money. So I've priced it very reasonably at $88. These are 60 to 90 minute sessions. So you are getting a whole lot, and we are going to be covering 5 main topics to bring you clarity. I do not have time at this time to go over that, but definitely pop over to my page if you're interested in learning more. There's a lot of links put up. It's in my stories. I've been talking about it all day via content. So all that information is there for you. And I hope you guys have a lovely